Welcome LAHS staff and students to the TEDxLAHS 2021 event. My name is Dia Gupta.
And my name is Lauren Dent, and we are officers of the TEDxLAHS Club, a collection of wonderful students and staff that brought this virtual event to life.
Our theme for this year's event is Cultivating Change. This year has been a strange one to say the least. No matter what life throws at us, we find ways to persevere and continue to share ideas worth spreading. This year especially requires us to unite and work together to cultivate change.
The TED Talks you will hear today range from finding solutions to the mental health crisis to exploring the scientific aspects of the virus that changed everything this year, COVID-19. They all encourage change, whether it be changing the way you view the world or simply increasing awareness of important and relevant issues today. We are holding this event today to spark conversation and carry out TED's main mission, sharing ideas worth spreading.
From Kenya to Colombia, from Iraq to Korea, in slums, in schools, in prisons, and in theaters, every day people gather at TEDx events around the world to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. Today, you are part of a global conversation about our shared future. So what is this TEDx? TEDx is an initiative of the TED Conference, a nonprofit devoted to ideas worth spreading. We grant free licenses to allow TED-like events to spread globally. This event today is based on the TED Conference format and ideals, but is independently organized by your local community. So please make sure to thank the team of volunteers who worked so hard on today's event. It's their ideas, dedication, and time that made it all possible. It's they who booked all the speakers, and the views you'll hear today are, of course, those of those speakers, not necessarily of TEDs. But we hope their talks spark an exciting conversation among you. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for openness and for critical thinking, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you'll take out. And now, on with the show.
Our first speaker, Shreya Anand, is a sophomore at Los Altos High School and the host of the podcast All About Her, where she interviews women in STEM and their careers and experiences. Her talk discusses the disparities that are often covered up in the field and tells the stories of women in STEM all around the world. Shreya's inspiration was her own love of STEM and, more importantly, her confusion about the various different fields. She hopes to help others understand how to overcome similar obstacles while empowering women all at the same time.
High schoolers are clueless. And the only reason I can say that so confidently is because I am one of them. There's an interesting progression of education in the US that seems to hold pretty common. Everything's absolutely fine until you hit high school. That's when the heat really starts to pick up. Suddenly you're expected to be doing calculus, writing in Spanish, speaking perfect English, and somehow memorizing the events that led to the French Revolution, all while keeping up with your extracurriculars and your social life. Yeah, super easy. But then they introduce the big word, college. Now for me, I've always been interested in STEM and public speaking, whether it's synthesizing new compounds and looking at different kinds of plants, or if it's just doing dramatics at school. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that to combine my interests is a lot more difficult than I might have ever thought. So I started to look into multiple different careers because I realized that my first grade aspirations of becoming a ballerina slash biochemist slash president of the United States, not exactly the most achievable goals. So as I was looking into new careers, I realized that there were two main issues that I was consistently facing. One, every time I looked at a new STEM career, which by the way, I can confirm there are over 100,000, I was immediately drawn to every single one. I did not know what to do. This was not helping me narrow down in the goal that I was trying to narrow down in which career choices that I could potentially pursue. But then the second one shocked me a little bit. I was constantly doubting my abilities, saying that I probably would never even be good enough to be in a field like that. And this one particularly scared me, so I decided that I wanted to go seek out some role models for women to get their advice on what exactly I should do, because I had no idea what I was doing. So I decided that I was also going to try to help the others around me that I'm sure were going through these very same issues. And I started my podcast, All About Her, where I interview various women in different STEM fields to understand their experiences and advice, and to try to implement that and figure out what exactly I wanted to do with my life. The strangest thing was that all of these incredibly successful women who seemingly had their lives together told me that they felt the same exact feelings that I was feeling as a lost high schooler. This blew my mind. But these main ideas of doubting yourself and feeling like you don't belong in a group tie into something called imposter syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it seems to kind of take over without anyone really realizing it. Now, I have only one slide for you today, so that's how you know it's going to be important. This is the percent of the 15 women that I've interviewed so far that have felt imposter syndrome at some point in their life. So in case you don't have the calculator on you, that means approximately 14 out of every 15 women in STEM have faced imposter syndrome, despite the fact that they're all incredibly successful, especially in my eyes, which completely blew my mind. How do successful people still feel insecure about why they're in their career? As I continue to delve deeper and interview more and more women, I realized that it wasn't just the idea of imposter syndrome, but the underlying idea of gender inequality in STEM. Most of the fields in STEM are male-dominated. I grew up hearing this phrase. In fact, less than a quarter of people in STEM are women. Even more shockingly, let's not even look at the statistics for women in leadership positions. So as I continued through this journey, realizing that it had more to do with gender inequality than I initially thought, I realized that it's surrounding me. It's surrounding so many different people. I'm incredibly privileged in the sense that I've been supported by the community around me, my friends, my family, and my teachers to persist through all the difficulties that imposter syndrome has thrown at me. But it still kind of creeps up on you, and a lot of people, unfortunately, don't have that community to help them deal with it. It's kind of like being controlled by an invisible force. Like with gravity, you don't really realize it's there until either an apple falls on your head or you fall flat on your face, and then it hits you like a ton of bricks. But seriously, it really is kind of shocking how it's ingrained itself into the minds of people in our society without anyone ever really noticing it. And it turned into this vicious cycle. The fact that most of the women I've spoken to have not seen any women mentors, have not seen any people they can look up to as women when they were growing up, just shows us how imposter syndrome eats away at them so much that they feel like they can't pursue their dreams. I remember back in grade school how no one really ever judged you. You know, you could do whatever you wanted, you wouldn't be judged. But as I've gotten older and older, and there are more advanced STEM classes, I'm noticing fewer of my female peers joining these classes, all with the same excuse that I'm not good enough. Imposter syndrome just keeps on planting seeds of doubt in everyone's minds, and it destroys our communities. So how can we stop this from getting any bigger? How can we fix this issue, even just with one individual? I've compiled a short list of advice from the women I've spoken to so far in hopes that we can all take a little bit of this information and try to implement it in our own lives. First, be bold and try new things. I know this can be a little bit hard because in a world where we all strive for perfection and we don't want to fail, we oftentimes just try to stay with the normal pack and not deviate. But the most successful people in our world today were not normal. They pushed themselves, and they've done things that may be considered failures now, but at the end of the day, ended up successful. We also need to remember that you aren't under any kind of time constraint if you're just in high school. I think that's a culture that we also oftentimes see. You have your entire life ahead of you. I've spoken to women in their 50s who still don't know what they want to do. And the point is that you experiment and you fail, but you always get up again. Second, never doubt yourself. This one's incredibly hard, especially for me. I see it in every aspect of my life, not just in school or in STEM. But we oftentimes tend to think that we aren't good enough based on whatever it is in our society. Overcoming that is the first step to destroying imposter syndrome. Showing the world that you don't care and that you're going to do whatever you want to do is that first step. So don't ever doubt yourself. Revel in your successes and learn from your failures, because that's what's going to make imposter syndrome go away for good. But finally, and I think most importantly, we need to build a community of support and positivity. These two ideas are generally seen together, but we don't see this community online or in person, especially now. We don't really get that opportunity to relate to other people. I hope that through this podcast, I can build a community where other women feel like they can go somewhere when they have these questions, that they're not completely alone, and that more than anything, they don't have to face it alone. Instead of having these events where women can showcase their work and talks like mine to spread awareness, or even my podcast, I hope we get to a point where we don't need to have any of this, where it's all normal, and women can just share their work without it being labeled as such. I hope that we can all learn, rather than looking at the women behind STEM, we look at the women leading STEM. Women like Emmanuelle Charpentier, Jennifer Doudna, Donna Strickland, Frances Arnold, and many, many more. The list goes on for women we constantly forget to appreciate. I want to leave everyone with one last idea from a mathematician that I spoke to recently. Surround yourself with people who believe in you. But more than anything, affirm yourself and your ideas, and tell yourself that you are awesome, because if you don't, no one else will. And I think that's one of the most important ideas that we can all take away. So hopefully with all of this advice, us high schoolers won't be half as confused anymore, and we'll finally be able to break out of the rule of imposter syndrome and gender inequality. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Zane Merchant, is a senior at Los Altos High School. He published several mobile apps and has started several businesses. He runs his own social media channels to document his entrepreneurial journey. He is a firm believer in the power of technology to solve problems and positively disrupt society, which he plans to discuss in his talk. In his spare time, Zane enjoys playing rock and metal guitar, as well as playing competitive badminton.
Hello everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about why I believe technology is the solution to the mental health crisis. Now, I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the ancient civilization of Sumer. Now, Sumer was an ancient Mesopotamian civilization that started around the year 4500 BC. They began to grow, they began to flourish. However, pretty quickly they encountered a problem. And this problem was, how should we reliably communicate information over long distances? See, up till now, there was no writing. These civilizations primarily relied on verbal communication. So it was easy to say something like, let's send 4 goats. But what happens when you need 7,000 goats, 437 oxen, 504 sheep? As information became more and more complex, it became essential for writing. And these civilizations didn't have it at that time. And what about accounting and documentation? This stuff became impossible. And some archaeologists actually looked into this. And they found that ancient civilizations ran into an information bottleneck when they reached a certain size. So what did this civilization do? Well, instead of merely trying to add words to their vocabulary, they invented a completely new system of communication. They used discontinuous thinking, and they actually invented the very first writing system, which came to be known as cuneiform. These same archaeologists then said once these advances in information processing and storage were achieved, you start to see the big empires of history emerge. So what does this have to do with my talk? Well, let me shoot some numbers at you. 51.5 million adults in the US have a mental illness. 23.6% of adults with mental illness say they have an unmet need for treatment. And clearly this is a big problem in my generation. 60% of youth with major depression don't receive treatment. However, we only have 106,000 licensed psychologists. With the millions of people experiencing mental health problems around the world, there is no way we can accommodate all the people who have an unmet need for treatment. So, just like the ancient civilization of Sumer, just like the ancient Sumerians, we are experiencing an issue of scale. So about 2 years ago, I was thinking about this problem, and I was thinking how I could begin to even solve this problem. And I realized that this problem required discontinuous thinking. It required non-conventional solutions, just like the civilization of Sumer. And around that time, I saw a quote that went something like this: "Unexpected kindness is the most powerful, least costly, and most underrated agent of human change." And I thought that this was interesting, right? This idea of using kindness and maybe positivity to help people with their mental health. So I began to think about this more, and I took this one step further, and I thought, what if I can use kindness paired with technology to help people with their mental health? What if I could match kindness givers with kindness seekers? See, we've seen this model work with technology before, matching seekers with givers, the Ubers of the world, the Airbnbs of the world. For example, let's take Craigslist, people who need something and people who are able to give something. GoFundMe, people who need help, people who are able to give help. What if I could do the same thing with kindness? In other words, what if I could crowdsource kindness? I thought this thesis of crowdsourcing kindness was interesting. So about 2 years ago, I went and I tried to do this. I developed an app. I called it Kindness Wins All. I called it a positive social media network. And I spent a lot of time developing the app, and I posted it on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. The app allows people to offer messages of hope, positivity, and comfort. And it also allows people to make kindness challenges. So you can challenge people to give compliments to one another. You can challenge people to donate to charity. And I posted it, and it turns out the phrase, "if you build it, they will come," is not necessarily true. You actually have to market yourself. And no one was just coming to the app. And so as someone my age might do, I started posting on social media to try to get people to the app. And what I did on social media was I posted good news stories. So I would tell heartwarming stories around the world. I try to be more positive on social media as opposed to the negativity on social media. And the goal was, of course, be more positive on social media, but also with that, maybe I could say something like, hey, if you want more positivity, come to my app. And it would serve both those purposes. And I started posting on social media, and I noticed something interesting. This is a graph of the number of views my videos got, the first 26 videos approximately. And my videos weren't getting a whole lot of views. As you can see at the beginning of the scatter plot, not a whole lot of views. But the instant that I posted a video that was related to the coronavirus, so I said something like, a new vaccine was approved, or cases went down, my view count spiked. In fact, each one of these spikes in view counts are because I posted a coronavirus-specific video. And this taught me something interesting, which was, number one, people are actually open to seeing positivity on social media as opposed to the negative news that dominates headlines. And second, I can actually reach those people, and I thought that was pretty interesting. So these social media posts ended up getting over 1 million views. My app ended up getting over 1,000 downloads, and I got comments like this: when someone is going through a rough/difficult time, they can come to this app and read good things to give someone hope and not give up. And I thought that was pretty cool. I wanted to take this one step further. I wanted to see if I could directly solve the issue of not having enough therapists. So what I decided to do was I wanted to try to put a therapist in everyone's room. A lot of people have Alexa voice devices at home, so I actually developed an app on Alexa that people could talk to and receive customized mental health help. And I've actually prepared a demo to show you exactly what this looks like.
Let us get started. Tell me how you are feeling right now. You can say something like sad, depressed, or anxious.
Sad.
I see. I am sorry you are feeling sad. Do you feel like you have lost interest in activities you used to enjoy?
Yes.
Feeling sad or depressed is common. I'd recommend you to try to get at least 8 hours of sleep and practice meditation every day to relax. As a simple exercise you can do right now, let's try expressing some gratitude.
And then, of course, the Alexa continues with the mental health exercise. It prompts for more exercises, and I'm currently developing this to make this even better. Now, this Alexa app ended up getting over 1,000 sessions. Now, don't just think about this as 1,000 engagements. Think about this as 1,000 therapy sessions from the comfort of someone's own home, from the privacy of someone's own home, absolutely for free. And I think that that's pretty powerful. So throughout these experiences, here's what I've learned. Number one, people are open to using technology to better themselves. I think through my social media posts, through my app, through my Alexa voice app, this has been made very clear to me. Number two, technology allows for ultimate scale. I would never have been able to reach 1 million people had I gone out and tried to manually talk to 1 million people. It just would not have been possible. And lastly, you have to be willing to explore non-conventional solutions. Technology is often demonized. Documentaries like The Social Dilemma have been trending and talking about the problems that technology poses. And look, I'll admit that technology has its problems. But instead of just trying to lock it out of our lives, let's figure out how we can use technology to better ourselves. Just like the ancient Sumerians, let's embrace the future and figure out how we can use technology to solve tomorrow's biggest problems. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Charles Atkins, is a senior at the Los Altos High School. When he isn't sprinting for the LHS track team, he enjoys reading and writing. In middle school, he founded the blog Neologicon, which explores philosophy, literature, psychology, and history. Interested in the question of how best to live and seeking the interconnection among philosophy, psychology, linguistics, and more, Atkins will examine in his talk the popularized Buddhist practice of mindfulness in an effort to recover its moral roots and its critical role in guiding people to be their best selves, as well as to live good, moral lives.
I'm sure all of us here are familiar to some degree with mindfulness, whether you've been made to do it in an English class, whether you've heard about it on YouTube, in a podcast, or from some influencer, whether you've seen it in the bestseller, spirituality, or self-help section of a bookstore, or whether you've taken it up yourself for its health benefits. Whatever the case, it's undeniable that mindfulness has exploded in popularity over the last 2 decades, just as it did, incidentally, about half a century ago in the 60s and 70s. For some, it invokes awkwardness and uncomfortability, having to close one's eyes, sit up straight, clear the mind, and count the breath. But for many, it's an effective tool for reducing anxiety, increasing focus, and being happier overall. However, when something becomes this popular, and especially when a practice from another culture becomes westernized, we ought to raise a few eyebrows, as there are bound to be simplifications and/or misunderstandings. And mindfulness is a notorious example thereof. That's why in this talk I want to re-examine mindfulness, a 2,500-year-old Buddhist concept, to see whether we can brush off some of the dust which has settled over the term and to recover something of its original sense, a sense which I think will make it more appealing and which will make you not just a more happier, relaxed person, but a more productive, moral, and compassionate person. Now, it's only natural that we begin by defining what mindfulness isn't and what it is. As we're accustomed to hearing it, mindfulness is present awareness. To be mindful is to be conscious of the sensations in and around oneself, to empty the mind, to be non-judgmental, to simply be. But what if that isn't, wholly the case? Now, behind me is a rather confusing looking diagram that I made, and it shows the etymologies or word histories of mindfulness, both in English and in Pali, the language which the Buddha spoke. Now, I made it a rather simplified chart, but the key takeaway is this. Interestingly enough, in their evolutions from Sanskrit and Indo-European, the words mindfulness and memory mean each other. That is, mindfulness means memory, and memory means mindfulness. So what's fundamental to Buddhism, then, is that mindfulness, sati, is inextricably bound up with memory. To be mindful is, in a sense, to have one's mind full, to recollect, remind, retain, to keep in mind. Yet this runs counter to our conventional understanding. After all, our memories are associated with the past, which means we're disengaged from the present. And isn't the goal to have our minds empty, not full? Well, the inconsistencies here arise from the following misunderstanding. Modern Western-day mindfulness is based on two practices, vipassana and anapana, which respectively mean insight and breathing. But mindfulness, remember, is sati. Well, what's happened is that the term mindfulness has been expanded to cover an array of practices. That's why we can speak of insight meditation, mindfulness meditation, and even being mindful of the breath. And yet, we shouldn't confuse them. Now, this is not to say that vipassana and anapana are necessarily wrong or incorrect, nor that we shouldn't practice them. What I'm saying is that we ought to recognize that insight meditation and being mindful of the breath are forms of and steps toward mindfulness, but not mindfulness as such. So, having clarified that, and knowing now that mindfulness and memory are related, we can ask the question, what is the relation between ethics and mindfulness, as the title of my talk indicates? Why is mindfulness the ground of ethics, and what does that actually mean? I'll use a couple scenarios to indicate what I hope to convey. So, every year, expecting a new self, new beginnings, a lot of us like to create New Year's resolutions. Maybe you want to drink water after every meal. Maybe you want to work out every day. Now, for the first couple days, weeks, we're all pretty consistent. We follow through pretty well. But about a month in, that all falls apart. About 8 out of 10 resolutions fall through by this time. And our day-to-day existence gradually wears down, weathers down our initial excitement and momentum. Soon enough, our hopes for a better self are reduced to mere idle wishes. Or suppose one day you're reflecting on your personal relationships. Maybe you feel you've been less kind than you would like to be. So you decide to live by the golden rule. You want to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or maybe you want to judge people less. All right? So this matters a lot to you. So you wake up the next morning with this thought fresh in your mind, you hype yourself up, and you go about your day trying to do your best to treat people kindly. But then the day wears on. Maybe you get a test back and see you've done poorly. Maybe you see somebody you don't like, or somebody says something that doesn't quite sit right by you. Maybe your mind wanders to the past, to things you regret doing, or it drifts to the future, to things which have yet to be done and which weigh upon you with their uncertainties. Soon enough, your resolutions of treating people kindly, of judging less, fade away and recede into the background and are forgotten. Now, it's not that you didn't care. It's not that you didn't want to be a kind of person. It's just life happened. Things got in the way. That's kind of our nature. We can't really commit ourselves to one central thing when so many others are vying for our attention. But this puts us in a bit of a bind because in self-help and psychology these days, and books like Atomic Habits and The Power of Habit, we're told that the key to a good life is making positive habits and breaking negative ones. But that's really hard to do. And sure, they give us tips like start small, make them measurable, do one at a time, reward yourself, but in the long run, I feel like that doesn't work for a lot of people. And this is where I believe mindfulness ought to come in. See, the key text in Buddhism that deals with mindfulness is the Satipatthana, which translates as either the foundation or establishment of mindfulness. And I would extend this language by then saying that mindfulness becomes the establishment or foundation of morality, that is, the ground of ethics. Now, ground, establishment, foundation, these words form a complex in that each of them refers to a bottom, a base upon which to build, a basis, a starting point which provides stability, integrity, and consistency to a structure so that it can stand on its own, so that it can be self-reliant. In this sense, mindfulness is purely formal. It can't tell us what the right thing to do is, but more importantly, it tells us how to do the right thing. It enables us to, in the heat of the moment, as we like to say, reflect critically and think upon the correct course of action that is befitting of the moment, and to recover a sense of ownership over our memories and our principles. Now, I like this quote by Aristotle because he draws on this connection between character and habit. When something becomes habituated or is habitual, it becomes a part of ourselves. It's almost a part of the fabric of our being. Now, you can imagine, if you have a mantra, a phrase or sentence which you repeat to yourself, something like, treat others how you want to be treated, or drink water after your next meal. And every single day, for just 5 to 10 minutes, you sit down and you commit it to memory. You repeat this. You establish a foundation in mindfulness. You train it into your subconscious. You can imagine it's going to be a lot easier to actually live out your principles consistently. Now, something that's kind of interesting to me is how rare the word conscientious is in our everyday vocabulary. And yet we understand it in sentences like, she's a conscientious worker. She's very conscientious of the needs of others. Now, the word conscientious actually sharply declined in literature by about 1840. There was a sharp decline, and making it a relatively rare word. Now, conscientious, as we understand it, means something like attentive, thoughtful. However, conscientious actually has moral overtones, as it derives from the word conscience. Accordingly, being conscientious originally meant listening to and abiding by one's conscience, one's code of conduct. Now, why am I bringing this all up? Well, being thoughtful, being full of thoughts, mindful. Notice what happens if we substitute mindful for conscientious. We get, she's a mindful worker, or she's very mindful of others and their needs. Thus understood, they're practically synonymous. Now, this connection is further enhanced if we realize that conscience itself derives from conscious, which, if we take that to simply mean awareness or self-awareness, relates even more intimately to our memories and our moral sense. So the final thought with which I want to leave you, and of which I want you to be mindful going forward, that is, to keep in mind, to think upon, is the following. To be mindful is to be conscientious. To be conscientious is to be ethical. Therefore, to be mindful is to be ethical. And that is why I believe you ought to practice mindfulness in order to be the best possible, authentic versions of yourselves. Thank you.
Born with sensorineural hearing loss, Xiao has had to adapt to life in a hearing world. She is an avid biker and enjoys spending time meeting new people, writing poems or op-eds, and teaching her bunny new tricks. Now a senior at Los Altos High School, she is sharing her story and speaking out about the damaging stereotypes towards the deaf or hard of hearing community. Her hope is to spread awareness about the challenges students with disabilities face and shift the conversation towards how we can contribute to a future of accessibility for everyone.
Imagine this. You're seated in a dark room, walls completely padded with foam. The little holes poked into the walls are the only source of air in this suffocating prison. There's a seat in the middle of the room, and wires snake across the floor and onto the walls. You sit down and the audiologist places the wires into your ears. Then you're instructed to click a button on the remote when you hear a beep. You look through the window at the doctor's blank expression. You feel stupid because you glance up amid this awkward silence as if there's a certain beep you're supposed to hear but you didn't. Sound is an elusive thing, always seeming to escape your reach. That is my experience of every visit to the audiologist. And every visit, I will see this crude curve. This is an audiogram, with the normal hearing being in the yellow, and everything below that is qualified as some sort of hearing loss. This is my most recent hearing test. My hearing was continuing to get worse over the years, eventually progressing from hard of hearing to deaf. So a little backstory. I was born with sensorineural hearing loss. I never had the luxury of matching sounds to everyday occurrences. Up until I was 4, I thought that people stretched their faces to communicate, that cars passed in silence, and those strange wires that people stuck into their ears were used to protect against the cold. So imagine my confusion when I saw these joggers running past with those white wires in their ears in 100-degree summer heat. How strange. My first experience with a hearing aid fitting was utterly confusing. Wait a minute. This peaceful realm of silence that I'd been used to was congested with sound. Did you guys know that airplanes make noise? And apparently there's this thing called music that you can hear through this wire that you stuck into your ears. So maybe those joggers weren't so strange after all. While in my hometown of Shanghai, China, I was surrounded with people who were aware of my disability. But when I moved to the United States when I was 6 years old, it all changed. 1. English was not my first language. More so, from elementary to high school, I had countless experiences with teachers and students who were unable to understand my need for extra support. There were instances where teachers refused to wear the FM system, which is a microphone that transmits sound directly into my hearing aids, or accommodate me in Socratic seminars when I had no clue what was being said. They assigned videos and podcasts that had no transcript. Because if just one student could not hear, was it really worth changing the curriculum for the 25 other hearing students? I became so self-conscious about these interactions that whenever I got a haircut, I would ask to have my hair cut into a bob long enough to cover my ears so I could hide my hearing aids. But even during the haircut, I would take my hearing aids off because I was afraid what the barber would think if he saw them. When I was picking out the color I wanted for my hearing aids, I would always pick black over rose gold because it was easier to conceal with my darker hair. This is something I've had to deal with my entire life growing up in the hearing community. When hearing people encounter individuals that differ from them, they tend to label them with the limited schemas that already exist. Even in the media, when you see a deaf character, what is going through your head? Maybe you're thinking of a mute who is frantically gesturing, as though they do not know how to communicate. Most of us speak the oral language, although some of us choose not to. Another misconception is that hearing loss is dependent on volume. So people assume that they need to over-enunciate or yell so that I can hear them. But I am relying on their lips to understand their speech. So when you're doing all of those things, you're distorting your facial expressions and making it harder for us to understand you. Even in healthcare institutions, there are misconceptions of deafness. This is a screenshot from the Mayo Clinic website, which includes symptoms. I repeat, symptoms of hearing loss as if it's a disease like the flu or AIDS. And that can be so dehumanizing because it then labels a whole community of people with having a disability that they have to live with. All of these classifications in today's society have affected the way people treat me. It is so frustrating having to navigate these predefined stereotypes of what a disabled student should look like. Even when it came to school, I was doing above average, and that gave the assumption that I didn't need any more accommodations. But even if it looked like I was succeeding, what most people didn't see was how hard it was just to get by. I had to study for my classes weeks or months ahead of time. I would preview the fall semester by taking college courses over the summer so I could have access to lecture transcripts. Because no matter how hard I tried to learn in a classroom, I simply could not close this huge gap of verbal communication. And then a pandemic struck, and I had to deal with the transition into remote learning. And it was then that I saw just how inaccessible accessibility is in the education system. I was not provided captions for the last 3 months of my junior year and the first 3 months of my senior year. Imagine how many lectures, units, or important information I missed during that 6-month period. I could no longer turn to the person sitting next to me for notes during class if I didn't catch something, or walk up to my teachers after school for support. I couldn't even carry out the most basic errands because masks covered people's faces and I couldn't rely on repeating to hear anymore. We live in the Silicon Valley, where progress and innovation are constantly seeing exponential growth. So it astounds me how limited technology is for people with disabilities. Think about it. I could change my background on Zoom to have videos of cats, but I couldn't even access what was being said. So here is an idea worth spreading. How can we rethink how we perceive disability and work towards a world of equity and accessibility? There is this perception of disability as something that someone can't do. And we get so caught up in what we cannot do that we forget the abilities we do have. I've been deaf for all my life, so that is the world that I've known and cherished. My attitude towards life is unique in this way because I've been involved in situations most hearing individuals never had to encounter. And because I can't hear, I rely on my other senses, and this gives a new sense of hearing most people don't have. That is a superpower, not a setback. The deaf community is a small one, but we need representation. We need social reform. We want to be included in the conversation, literally and figuratively. One step we can take by making captioning more accessible. Advocate for having captions automatically turned on in every video conferencing app, YouTube, social media platforms. If you're a host on Zoom, take a minute to turn on live transcript in the settings so that any meeting participant can access captions at their own need. This is not an automatic feature for some reason when it should be. The best way to destigmatize something is to talk about it. And it goes both ways. We need to start a conversation about how we can be more inclusive towards the deaf and hard of hearing community, but it also starts with their advocacy. Reaching out and asking, how can I help you? Is there anything I can clarify for you? Or let me know if you need support. It's a good starting point. You can also support, download, or spread awareness about companies like Hamilton Relay, Ava, and Web Captioner, who in the past couple of years have been creating innovative solutions with captioning and accessibility. Even despite the challenges that I've endured, I realize that I'm a person of privilege to be in a place where there are financial resources to support me. Because the reality is most students with disabilities across the schools in the United States do not. So it's my job to use my voice. Individually, I don't have the power to bring systemic change, but by speaking out here today, we can start something. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Sarah Sue, is a sophomore at Los Altos High School with a love for all things chemistry, whether it's mixing ingredients or performing organic chemistry research. Her passion for medicine and research has been exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic, and she has been researching the virus in hopes of finding a treatment. She hopes to be able to incite a similar passion in others, as well as to increase education regarding the uses of computational chemistry for pressing medicinal issues.
Hi, today I'd like to talk to you about the future of medicine, computational chemistry. So just for a quick introduction, hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a sophomore at Los Altos High School, and I'm also a high school researcher at Aspiring Scholars Directed Research Program, which is basically a program that allows high schoolers to conduct their own original research. And so there, I'm a synthetic organic chemist, and what I work on is in the drug discovery process. And that's how I can tell you that the drug discovery process takes a really, really long time. You start off with something called analog design, where you figure out what you even want to make. And oftentimes people will want to make libraries of compounds even up to like 100. And then you go on to chemical synthesis, and that's like where you actually go into lab and you make whatever you said you wanted to. And this process takes a really long time because you have to start off with setting up your reaction, and then after you set up your reaction, you have to purify it. And finally, you have to characterize it. And these 3 steps can take up to weeks. But then you combine the fact that perhaps you said that you wanted to make 100 compounds in the beginning. You have to do this process over and over again 100 times. And oftentimes, this process takes up to years to even complete your compound library, and that's barring any complications. And finally, after you've spent perhaps 2 to 3 years making your library of compounds, you can finally test it. And imagine how disappointing it is if you spent 2 to 3 years working hard to make all your compounds, and then you find out that none of them work. Obviously, this process is highly inefficient because we see this happen all the time. And that's where computational chemistry can step in. Computational chemistry can pre-screen our compounds before we actually go into the lab and synthesize them and spend inordinate amount of times trying to make them and finally test them. And so to do this, we use computer models for drug discovery. It starts off with de novo molecular design, which is almost analogous to the analog design of the traditional drug discovery process. And it's basically where you figure out what you want to screen. Then you go on to something called density functional theory. And this is something you can just download onto your computer. It's completely open source. And you just plug in your molecule through there, and it comes out, and it's completely optimized. It's like it would be in the real environment. Then after that, you can use something called molecular docking, where you see how your compound interacts with its target. So for example, if your compound's supposed to interact with a protein, this molecular docking can first of all show you the orientation of it, but second of all, it can tell you how well this compound would bind to the protein. And that's really powerful because if your compound binds really, really well to that protein, then you can basically say, hey, this is actually worth synthesizing. But if it doesn't bind very well to the protein in the first place, you don't want to be spending those years making it. And then finally, you can do something called a molecular dynamics simulation, and this just shows you a real-time simulation of your protein against your compound. And this is really cool because you can see perhaps your protein folding or something. And all of this just goes to show that there are so many computational techniques to help you refine the drug discovery process. And so at our lab, we have this 26-core server, which we use to screen 400 compounds to find a treatment for COVID. And we basically just use those 400 compounds and we plug them into the computational chemistry process. And so here are a couple articles from the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak a year ago. And I think it's really noteworthy to mention that we actually started our research on COVID right at the outbreak of the pandemic. And so even though no one was allowed to be anywhere in person, we were able to continue our research because all of our research was now stored on our computers. And so if you want to figure out how to cure COVID, you first have to understand how COVID works in your body. And you can kind of think of it like this. It's like a long chain of events. And at the end of it, COVID proliferates inside your body, making you sicker and sicker. But if we cut off one of the links to those chains, COVID won't be able to grow through this process, and it's not going to be able to proliferate. And so that's exactly what we did. We cut off this process right here, where there's an enzyme in your body called the main protease, and it binds to the COVID protein. And since we can stop that process, we can stop COVID from being able to proliferate inside your body. And so to do that, this is an example of our inhibitor, and the bottom thing is basically the protein that we were trying to inhibit. And you can kind of think of this as a door stopper. Our inhibitor is a door stopper, and it's permanently stuck there, so that COVID can no longer enter, it can no longer bind with the protein, because our inhibitor is already stuck there. And so to do this, we actually use computer models for drug discovery to test whether or not our inhibitors would actually work before we went into lab and synthesized them. So first we start off with some biological inspiration for our protein. So this is the native compound that binds to our enzyme, and we just militarize that. So this is basically the de novo molecular design portion of the computational chemistry process. And then after that, we plugged it into the rest of the steps, so the density functional theory and the molecular docking. And once we did that, we identified our hit compounds. So you can see here, these are our 2 best compounds, and you can judge that because they had the 2 best binding affinities to our COVID enzyme. And because of this, we have cut down our library of 400 compounds to simply 2. And synthesizing, going through the traditional drug discovery process with 400 compounds might have taken us even 10 years. But 2 compounds could take us a matter of months. And not only that, it took us only 2 months to even screen them on the computer. And so I just really want to emphasize how cool computational chemistry is. Not only that it's improving the drug discovery process by making it so much faster and so much more efficient, but the fact that it is so accessible. The fact that teenagers like me and my friends are able to use this program to find treatments for COVID really means something, and I hope that computational chemistry will improve the future of medicine by not only making it more efficient, but by making it more accessible and creating a safer world for everyone. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Fernanda Palacios, is a senior at Los Altos High School and will be talking about gentrification in Mountain View.
Emma and I were starstruck. We had just gone through junior high together, and now we were finally taking on a major stepping stone towards our real future. We shared similar aspirations, such as working in the STEM fields and being the first in our families to graduate college, even high school. We both aspired to be role models for our younger brothers. We got into our school's AVID program together, a program designed to help first-gen students like ourselves better prepare for college. We both loved window shopping downtown together, enjoyed stargazing from Los Altos Hills. We even had the same McDonald's orders. To say the least, we were inseparable and indistinguishable. Like many of the other families in Mountain View, our families frequently discussed this possibility of moving outside of Mountain View. At some point for Emma's family, this became a reality when the ever-increasing rent costs ended up outweighing the pros of having high-quality school and work opportunities. Her family's displacement was a direct result of gentrification the Bay Area has been experiencing. You see, a couple years back when I thought of gentrification, I thought of urban development, change, and in the words of Lupe from the Netflix TV show Gentrified, nobody likes change, but if you can align with it, change can be good. Well, much of the change gentrification brings comes in the forms of improved infrastructure, transportation, schools, aesthetics, and more investors for the local businesses and real estate. All already good changes, so what is there to align with? Well, all this positive change creates demand, and with insufficient supply, housing costs skyrocket and affordable housing plummets. When you think of gentrification, which of these scenarios do you think of? Because I think of neither, or maybe even both. I think of Emma and other low-income families struggling to catch up with all these rent increases. Emma, for example, was a stellar student attending a great high school. Up until enjoying all these positive changes around her, up until the day she ended up having to suddenly move out. Like I mentioned, we both got into our school's AVID program. We are both seniors. Hopefully next year we'll both be in college. Well, the AVID here, we did plenty of things this year. We got to file our FAFSA right when it came out with the help of financial aid experts. We got to fill out college and scholarship applications with experienced mentors. We got to explore special programs colleges offer for first-generation students like ourselves. And now we're currently learning about finances and budget tracking with the help of Comerica bankers. You see, this is very different for Emma. For Emma, her AVID class only let them know about the reputationally complex FAFSA, did not provide mentors or experts or bankers. Not only did these changes impact Emma's schooling, it also impacted her younger brother. He was diagnosed with autism before their family left to Stockton. The special education program there has changed location 3 times, creating tremendous instability for a 5-year-old. Had he stayed in the area, he would have been able to attend one of the best programs for autism. Another way in which people align to these changes but continue to live near their school and work locations is by living in RVs. And like I previously mentioned, gentrification brings improved aesthetics. And to many, RVs are not their definition of aesthetically pleasing. So in Mountain View, this has created a desire to pass Measure C, an ordinance that prohibits oversized vehicles from parking down narrow streets of 40 feet wide or less. This ordinance was passed in December 2020. You heard that right, December 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic. And The Voice, a local media company, said it's expected to cost $980,000, nearly $1 million, to implement parking restriction signs all around the city starting in April 2021, this month. Not only is this wrong because it will bring more uncertainty into people's lives during already uncertain times, but it is also problematic for local businesses that are already struggling to hire service employees. And if these people move out too, eventually small businesses will be at risk too. Furthermore, this raises a question. Is there really no better way to use all these resources? A more creative way to use $1 million? So, should we have people keep living in RVs? Not necessarily. RVs are short-term solutions. We shouldn't have to choose between letting entire families live in RVs or forcing them out of our cities like some suburban variation of deportation. So now you may be wondering, then what is the solution? Some risks our counties and cities can and have taken include rent control, tiny houses, low-income housing, and working alongside some of our largest employers. Rent control is when our local government prohibits landlords from raising the rent drastically, say double the rent this month to the next. Tiny houses is something cities like San Jose have already started implementing, and that's semi-permanent housing that is designed to help prepare families to get back up on their feet after a couple months. Low-income housing is something Palo Alto and Mountain View have already started doing, and that is to set aside a handful of apartments and rent them at a lower cost. Working alongside some of our large employers is also something Mountain View has already tried. And just March 8th, to be exact, with Google. All of these risks are risks. They come with their own set of flaws, and they may not be perfect solutions or even solutions at all. But it is risks like these, visionary ideas like these, that will help us avoid the displacement and marginalization of our community's original investors. You see, if we want to have the most visionary future leaders, we have to have diversity in our schools. According to MDPI, a publisher of scientific journals, when there was a drop in 2013 of low-income residents in gentrifying areas of the Bay Area, there was also a drop in non-white residents, vice versa for the non-gentrifying areas. Let's get one thing straight here. Gentrification is not the villain. It doesn't have a mind of its own, and it doesn't only target certain racial groups. Instead, gentrification only exposes pre-existing racial disparities in our communities. Our school's purpose should be to produce effective community and business leaders who will be well equipped to work and deal with diverse problems. Emma, for example, is one of many future leaders LHS is missing out on. Sacrificing diverse communities is not a solution. If we don't want people having to make these kinds of choices, we have to help find adequate solutions, or at least just be open to them. We have to ask ourselves, how will we align to these nearly inevitable changes, and will we be the unbothered or the solution-seeking neighbors? Thank you.
Our next speaker, Harini Nagappan, is a sophomore at Los Altos High School, and she spends her free time reading, writing, baking, and hiking. Outside of school, Harini is a dedicated scout and an avid volunteer. Being a high schooler herself, she understands the pressure put on teenagers and the lifelong effect it has. Being a first-hand witness to the drawbacks of society, Harini hopes to fight against the stigma of stress and disabilities. Through her own personal experiences, she aims to talk about the domino effect stress has on one's life and what we as a society can do to reverse this.
We've all heard about stress and its effects, but how deep does stress hit, and what really happens when you're stressed? Let's find out. Your body sends hormones like adrenaline, cortisol, and norepinephrine, the three main stress hormones, pumping throughout your body, sending signals to your brain telling you that you're in danger. Your heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, your muscles tighten, you breathe faster, and your senses get sharper. Your body is basically preparing for a fight or flight response. Stress also affects your telomeres. Telomeres are like aglets, or the caps on the end of your shoelace, but for your chromosomes. Telomeres are made up of TTA, GGG, repetitive unessential strands of DNA, and they protect your chromosomes. An enzyme called telomerase can replenish your telomeres, but excessive cortisol in your system can decrease the amount of telomerase you have. When a telomere becomes too short, the chromosome dies, and all the cells in our bodies have chromosomes. Without our chromosomes, all these cells die, and this is what leads to aging and the numerous illnesses that come with old age. A study done a few years ago, with the main subjects being caregiving mothers with physically or mentally disabled children, showed that the longer a caregiver raised that child, the shorter their telomeres were, meaning stress is directly linked to your well-being. But stress is sneaky. It has a way of hiding in your body, and you may never even notice the symptoms of stress. Stress is also a proxy killer. You may die because of a heart attack or some other illness, but stress is a leading factor behind all these illnesses, and stress is responsible for approximately 60% of all deaths. But I know facts aren't enough to convince an audience, so I'm going to tell you what stress had, an effect stress had on someone very close to me. Let's call them John. John was a people pleaser. Everyone loved John. He would go out of his way to help others around him, and he would always be willing to do the work no one else wanted to do. John worked in the IT industry, an immensely competitive field where he had to constantly prove that he was capable and fit to work in the company. Beyond his own work, he helped others with their work. He helped other coworkers with their extra projects, started looking for his own house, started to build his own business, all while taking care of his family. A normal day for John was waking up at 7:30, dropping off his kids at school, and then going to work. And then he came back home at around 6, working on his extra projects, helping his younger coworkers, working on his startup, eating dinner at 10, usually 11, then working some more and sleeping later than 1 in the morning, and doing this all over again. Speaking from my experience, juggling just my extracurricular activities and school is already hard, but for John to be doing so much work, all while taking care of his family and continuing doing all his work, it came with immense consequences. On February 14th, John had a stroke. He couldn't wake up and had to be transported to the hospital by ambulance. The common reasons for having a stroke are high cholesterol, diabetes,
obesity, high blood pressure, smoking, and drinking. But John was as healthy as could be. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he didn't have high blood pressure or high cholesterol, and he didn't have diabetes, and he wasn't overweight either. So what caused the stroke? The reason? Stress. John went through brutal physical therapy, he had major surgeries and multiple setbacks, and a whole lot of guilt, not only from himself, but also his family. I was given permission to tell this story because John's family wants everyone to know the effect stress can have on our lives. We emphasize mental health so much, yet no one knows of the consequences. If you're going to take away one thing from this presentation, know that stress kills, and that you can do something about it. There are 1,440 minutes in a day. Can't you take one for yourself? If you don't want to do it for your well-being, do it for the ones who love you. As a high schooler, I put off stuff for tomorrow every single day, a habit I am working on. But when it comes to life and death, there are no second chances, and there is no tomorrow. We've all told ourselves later, but we all know how often that becomes never. You can't change the past, no matter how much you hope, pray, or wish, but you can change your actions in the present and change your future for the better. As a plea from the hundreds of millions who suffer from stress and illnesses and diseases related to stress, I ask that you focus on yourself. Don't punish yourself over the mistakes you made in the past. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Karan Dalal, is a junior at Homestead High School. After finding himself with a surplus amount of free time during the distance learning transition, Karan co-founded a pet tech startup called Pet Code. Through his experiences, he has come to understand the importance of unprepared speaking. During his talk, Karan will share some of his favorite tips and tricks to perfecting the art of impromptu.
Hi everyone, my name is Karan. I'm a junior from Homestead High down in Cupertino. I'm also the co-founder of a tech startup called Pet Code, which means I have to talk. I talk a lot. Most of my speaking, from TV interviews to investor pitches, most of my speaking is impromptu, which basically means there's absolutely no preparation. Speaking on a dime, if you will. So impromptu speaking is actually a very useful life skill that's used in a variety of situations. Most people don't know it, but they probably use impromptu speaking in their daily lives. So obviously there's things like question panels and unscripted interviews where you would use it. But imagine you come home from a long, tedious day at school. So you walk in the door, you drop your heavy bag on the ground, and you're ready to go relax. But then you hear your mom and she's calling you into her room. So you walk in and she has this up on her computer screen. And she basically asks you, "Hey honey, why are your grades so low?" So this is also an impromptu speaking situation because you have to respond without any sort of preparation and get your point across without having any sort of scripted speech. So it's very common to speak impromptu, much more common than people think. Now, my first official setting speaking impromptu was when I was trying out for my school's FBLA chapter. You have to try out to participate in a competition. So basically what you would do is, you go in, you put your hand in a bag and you draw out a prompt and you'd have to create a speech almost immediately and speak for 3 minutes about that specific prompt. So I go in there and I put my hand in the bag, I pull out a prompt and I read it and it basically says, "If you could give yourself a new name, would you?" Now, I was excited to speak about this prompt. Quick backstory. My name is actually, a mirage of sorts. So it's actually spelled like this. That's how I write it on tests and papers. But for some reason, when people read it aloud for the first time, it turns into this. So it's almost kind of like a mirage of sorts. It's some sort of hallucination magic going on there. And it's also fostered my hate for substitute teachers. But that's a story for another time. So I go in there, you kind of actually get 30 seconds once you pull the prompt out of the bag to get settled, get ready. And throughout those 30 seconds, my head is completely empty. It kind of, there's absolutely nothing going on there. That's kind of a representation of what I was thinking. So, I'm totally unprepared. I begin speaking, and I'm all over the place. I try to connect some emotional aspects of my name with some more humor parts. but it turned out as dark humor, which wasn't good at all. The evaluators didn't have any follow-up questions for me. They just let me know, hey, you're over the time limit, and next time you do a presentation, make sure not to buckle the bottom button of your suit. Needless to say, I didn't move on to the next round of interviews, which sucked. But since then, I've had the opportunity and to do much more impromptu speaking and hone in and refine my skills. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tips and tricks that I've used to make myself a better impromptu speaker. So to begin with, I'd say the most important guideline is to know where you're going to end your speech before you even start speaking. And make sure that that ending is a strong, impactful statement. Many times, audiences have very short attention spans, including audiences I've been part of. And the way that we conclude our statements and our speeches is the most important because that's the only thing the audience is going to remember when they walk out of that room. So going back to our example of your grades, before you even start making excuses, decide on whether or not you're going to tell your mom about that physics test you just took. Now you kind of know what you're trying to say in response to your prompt. You know what the end goal of your speech is. But how do you get started? Well, as a reminder, impromptu is completely unprepared. You don't have any time to just, pull an Adam Sandler, pull a remote out of your back pocket and pause time while you come up with some sort of scripted speech. You just have to start going. And that's actually the best way to do it. You just start speaking. Once you start speaking, you'll see these connected thoughts and ideas just jumping out at you. It's quite a sensation, actually. I like to think of it as Spider-Man, swinging on his webs, where the webs just keep coming and he keeps swinging. So it's the same thing for you. Just start going with the flow and slowly carving your way towards your ending statement, making sure to stay, obviously, within any sort of time limits or any sort of, make sure you're not speaking too fast or slow. Now, it may be easier to anticipate when you might have to speak impromptu. For example, you're more likely to give an unprepared speech at your best friend's wedding toast than at a funeral. But in general, it helps to be a well-read individual. The more knowledge you gain throughout your daily life and more information you collect from things like books, reading the news, and even watching television, the more knowledgeable you are on almost any topic. And that makes it much easier to speak about almost anything. In the case that you aren't too familiar about a specific topic, just tell a story that has something to do with it. Because trust me, all audiences love a good story, especially when it ends with a funny punchline. The main skill that you have to develop when you're speaking impromptu is the ability to talk while you think. This skill isn't something that you can just finish in an hour. It takes, days, if not months, of dedicated work to get down. Because essentially what you're doing is training your brain to do two things at the same time, which isn't, what it's essentially made for. There are a couple exercises, though, to help you along your way to getting good at this skill. My favorite one is called mirror talk. And as the name suggests, it's basically staring at yourself in the mirror and reciting a short speech, nothing longer than 30 seconds. When you're first starting out, you'll find it difficult to maintain a sense of clarity as you stare at yourself. But as time goes on, you should not only see an improvement in your focus, but you should also see an improvement in your talking while thinking functions. Now lastly, a couple red flags when impromptu speaking. Number one, you never ever want to apologize for making any sort of mistake. Not only are you delaying the further continuation of your speech, but you're also giving that mistake more attention than it deserves. And you're allowing your audience to focus in on that mistake instead of the speech, which is actually what you're there to give. So the best option is just to glance over it, keep going, because I assure you, your audience will do the same. The second red flag is to not drag on. When you make a conclusion, just stick with it. Even if you have a better idea, you just think of an idea right after, just stick with that single conclusion. Because when you start making conclusion after conclusion, you drag on your speech, you confuse your audience and take away from the impact that that conclusion is supposed to have. And lastly, don't be a perfectionist. Speaking impromptu is difficult, and your audience understands that as well. And as mentioned before, just glance over it, move on, and your audience will do the exact same thing. Once you get good enough at impromptu speaking, it'll be almost indistinguishable from your normal speech writing talking skills. I hope some of these tips and tricks will allow you to become a better impromptu speaker. Thank you for your time.
Our next speaker, Donna Young, is a senior executive with the Permanente Medical Group who moved to California in 1978 and holds degrees from Stanford University and Berkeley. While her son was an LHS student, she was active in local fundraising and Parent-Teacher Association activities. Besides being a mom, one of her greatest personal achievements is training for and completing 2 marathons to raise $8,000 for the SF AIDS Foundation. She enjoys reading, playing the piano, outdoor activities, gardening, and is currently obsessed with Schitt's Creek.
My name is Donna Young, and I am thrilled to be here today at TEDx Los Altos High School 2021. I fell in love with the Bay Area when I moved to the state in 1978. In 1992, my then husband and I decided to relocate to Los Altos from San Mateo. I still remember the discussions we had about why Los Altos, why not Sunnyvale or Mountain View, Palo Alto? Maybe I wore him down by dragging him to see 34 houses in a weekend, but I was absolutely convinced that Los Altos was where we should start our family and raise our family. We both were very committed to educating our children in a public school system, and Los Altos schools are top tier in the state. They were then, and that holds true today. Another reason that I fell in love with Los Altos is it is a dog town. The minute we closed on our house just down the street, we adopted a dog. I am now on my 3rd dog as a Los Altos homeowner, and I love how easy it is to walk our dogs, enjoy the neighborhood, meet fellow dog owners and their fur babies. Diversity was a consideration, but we ultimately decided to settle in Los Altos despite the fact that there was a lack of diversity in the community, especially African Americans. Today, I would like to share with you the challenges of living while Black in Los Altos and why what we say matters. When I first moved here, I've quickly discovered that there were several businesses that did not deserve my business. That remains true today. There are a few stores in downtown Los Altos where I will not shop, because when I do go in, I am watched and or followed as if I look like somebody who's going to steal something. Another example is my son Austin, who rocked an afro when he attended Los Altos High School roughly 10 years ago. Remember when I talked about how walkable Los Altos is? I still marvel at our ability to take walks almost every day of the year. But when Austin took a walk, he always had to carry his license with him because he was routinely stopped by local police officers and asked to prove that he lived in our neighborhood. I guess that's because young men with afros don't belong here, and if they are here, they must be up to no good. Don't get me wrong, I am very supportive of our local police officers and all of the others that do everything they can to ensure our safety in this community. But did you ever notice that when cars in our town are pulled over, a large percentage of the time the occupant is a person of color? I've noticed, and that's in the context of an area that has very little crime. And then there was the time that I was DWB'd, that means driving while Black, 200 feet from my house. I was making my usual coffee run to Pete's on State Street, and on my way back, there was a police car, rarely seen on that street, that I passed. I instinctively looked down and checked to make sure that I was not speeding, and then I noticed that he immediately made a U-turn and began to follow me. And then 200 feet from my house, he pulled me over by turning on his lights. I instinctively did what all black people know to do, which is to put their hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. And when he walked up, I put my window down. He stated that he had smelled marijuana when his car passed me. Now, I was driving a BMW 750 Li on Hawthorne Avenue, just past the nursery. I don't use marijuana, and even if I did, that is a lot of marijuana for him to have smelled it from his car. He was trying to see what he could see inside my car and also get a whiff, perhaps, of some marijuana. He did not give me a ticket, but he asked me for my license and walked back to his car to run it through his system. When he returned, he handed me my license without an explanation or an apology and said, "Here you go," and walked away. Now, how do you think I experienced that? I was angry, I was frustrated. The whole time I was doing a quick calculus as to what to say and how to act. These are the mental gyrations that all black people have to go through in a similar circumstance. Is it okay to talk back? How can I make sure this doesn't escalate? In my case, I was thinking, what about my son? Why? Because I am a black mother with a black son, and even if it was a circumstance where I could have said something, I didn't feel safe. As my friend in New Jersey would say, not for nothing, meaning there is a very good reason why I was DWB'd. Now, let's talk about some examples from my experience as a leader in a corporate setting. I am an African-American woman who's led a very successful career as a senior executive. All African-American women who have had successful careers have had very similar experiences long before social media and our heightened awareness today. Let me give you a few examples. If someone at work says to me, "Do you know someone?" and I reply that I don't, and then they say, "Well, you must know them," there's a very good chance that that individual is black. Or how about when my colleague, a white male, called me and said, "I'm the only one that doesn't think you're scary." What is it about me that is scary? Is it my towering height? I'm 5'1", or is it my booming voice? I have had people at work tell me that I'm not black or act shocked when I say that I am black. And I can only assume that that is because I don't look like what they think an African-American female looks like, when there are many African-American females who share my characteristics. I'll name a couple: Vanessa Williams, Paula Patton. I'm sure it didn't go unnoticed that I named two beautiful actresses. And then there is my hair. My hair is naturally curly, but I wear it straight. And that is because when I wear my hair curly, it is long and it is voluminous, and it becomes the object of how people describe me. Or people at work were constantly asking me if they could touch it. So I made the tough decision to wear my hair straight instead of curly, so that it would not detract from how I was viewed as a leader, and I felt like I would then be taken more seriously. Now, I often ask myself, what am I bringing to these interactions? Am I just too jaded and hypersensitive? Maybe I'm misinterpreting. We have to remember that I cannot be a neutral party in this because of experiences I have had since I was very young. I still remember my parents and family being with other white families, and the praise that was heaped on my parents about how well behaved their 4 children were. I remember Robert Bragg, yes, I'm going to say his name, running up to me in the 4th grade, spitting in my eye and calling me the N-word. To this day, I still have people that are incredulous when I say that I have degrees from Stanford and Berkeley, or that I used to own a horse when I was in high school. And you know, the other day, I just had an aha moment. I was talking with a friend who lives in West Hollywood, LA. He's a great African-American guy, and he, at that time, expressed frustration when we were on the phone because once again, while he was out walking this beautiful Great Dane named Lula, he was asked, "Is that your dog?" Now, super friendly guy, talkative, will pick up garbage on the street, but why is it assumed he's the dog walker, huh? I know that this may be a slightly different view of the bucolic picture that many have of Los Altos. However, we have to acknowledge that both pictures are true and that the harm and the damage is still there, even if I am hypersensitive. But here's the good thing. I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to share my experiences with you so I can underscore why what we say to each other, almost always unintentional, can lead to emotional scarring and or bitterness. I really believe in the importance of our collective attention to improving how we interact with each other and how we view each other. I am hopeful that, especially given these times, my sharing this very deeply personal account of living while Black in Los Altos will shed a light on our collective responsibility to cultivate change, especially given that we're coming out of a global pandemic, still pursuing social justice and addressing systemic racism in our society. This starts with how we interact with and how we treat each other. And I am optimistic that together we can shape Los Altos into a community that embraces African Americans and all people of color. I'd like to close with one of my favorite quotes from Audre Lorde. She says, "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." Thank you.
Our next speaker, Richard Field, works as a safari guide in Australia. He figured out at just 7 years old that he wanted to be a safari guide, and as soon as he finished university, he left to start his life in the wilds of Africa. As a trusted and a loved safari guide, it seemed like he lived a remarkable life. But it wasn't all that smooth sailing. In his talk, Richard will share his personal challenging experiences that have helped shape him into who he is today. Richard has a real passion for sharing his story with high school students. He hopes that the perspectives and understandings that he shares will help utilize them into understanding their own challenges to become the humans they wish to be.
Have you noticed that there are no straight lines in nature? Well, life doesn't operate in straight lines either. Now, you might imagine as you launch yourselves into the world that achieving your dreams might be as simple as going from point A to point B, a nice straight line. But life doesn't operate in straight lines. It tends to look a bit more like a roller coaster. And on this ride, life will take you to places that you might not really want to go yourself. Now, these detours might come in the form of a significant event. maybe an accident or illness, maybe loss, maybe you screw up really badly, or maybe you just don't seem to fit in with the expectations of those around you. Whatever form it takes, it often involves trauma and it always involves pain. Now, no one asks for that, but it's something that everyone at some point will have to face. No one gets through life unscathed. We all have our scars. Here are mine. All my life I wanted to become a safari guide in Africa. I dreamt of living and working in remote and beautiful places teeming with wildlife. I loved being in the wilds and looking for animals as a kid, and more than anything I loved lions. I found them just magnetic. They were the main reason I wanted to be a safari guide, but I also found them totally terrifying. When I began my life as a safari guide, my greatest fear was that I might one day get attacked by a lion. In my mind, there was nothing more terrifying than that. So I've learnt that life has a bit of a twisted sense of humour. When I was 25 and living and working in a beautiful, wild, remote corner of Botswana, teeming with wildlife, I got attacked by a lion. That morning I was guiding some very important safari clients and we were in an open safari vehicle. And I'd found the tracks of a female lion with tiny baby cubs. Now she'd been walking down a sandy road for several miles and the tracks were super fresh. And I was getting excited that I might actually be able to show my guests the sighting of a lifetime. But the tracks disappeared, so I stopped the car, I got out and walked back behind the car to look for the tracks, not realising that the lioness and her cubs were hiding behind a large termite mound about 30 yards away. Now, she charged, and she didn't stop. She knocked me to the ground, she raked my head with her claws, and she bit down hard on the back of my head. Now, a couple of hours earlier when I'd hopped out of bed that morning, my life was just full of hope and dreams and potential. Now I had a lion biting me on the head and my blood and my life was seeping into the sand. Your life can change very quickly. Now, I was incredibly lucky. My life was saved by my guests who managed to drive the car at the lion and chase her off. And while I eventually recovered physically, I remained traumatized by the event for a long time. This was the worst thing that I could ever imagine, made worse by the pain and trauma that had been inflicted on my family and friends. It looked for certain that my guiding career was over and it just felt like my life was falling apart. I certainly didn't want any of that. And there was nothing in that whole scenario that I could see that was positive. I did eventually return to guiding safaris, but early on I made a decision not to talk about the lion. It felt that the best thing for everyone, including myself, was for me to just try and wipe the experience from my life. So I avoided situations where someone might ask me about it. And if a safari guest ever asked me if I'd ever had a close call, then I'd give them pretty much any other experience, but I wouldn't give them that one. In my mind, I didn't want this to define me. I wanted to be known as a great safari guide or a great photographer or pretty much anything other than the dummy who'd gotten attacked by a lion. So I popped the story in a box and I shut the lid tight and I carried it around with me in my personal baggage for about 15 years. You see, I thought my life would be better with the story locked away. But after all that time, my life was still a constant struggle and that box was getting very, very heavy. So I eventually made the decision to accept the lion attack as a part of my life. I opened the box and had a good look around inside, and I started to share the story willingly. You know, allowing people to understand the experience that I'd had and the journey that it had taken for me to be able to share it. And in doing so, I discovered that the box that I'd been carrying around with me for so long had everything that I needed for a happy and fulfilling and meaningful life. Now, when I spoke to people, I found that, a lot of them were moved and inspired by what I said. Not just by the story, but also the journey afterwards. Some of them began to look at their lives differently as a result, which was fantastic. But the person that benefited the most from me sharing the story was me. Every time I shared it, I discovered something new for myself, some new perspective or lesson, or just a big reminder on how to live my life. When I opened the box, one of the things I rediscovered was the moment when the lion bit me on the head. When I felt her teeth biting down, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was going to die. But it wasn't my life that flashed before my eyes. Instead I saw all the things that I hadn't done in my life. I could see with great clarity that I'd taken for granted all the love and care of the people that I loved the most. And I'd never returned their love anywhere near as much as I should have. And I saw how much time I'd wasted. And as the teeth bit down harder, I could see that I'd never really given of myself. And I could see how much I actually had to give, but now there was no more time. It was a moment of just indescribable pain and regret. But it was also the most fundamentally powerful and motivating moment of my life. And that moment had all but disappeared when the story was sitting in a box. But it was probably the first thing that came leaping out after it had been opened. And this moment is now at the forefront of my mind when I make plans and decisions around my life. It reminds me that I need to keep focus on what's really important. And I need to share my gifts. I need to let people see me, and I need to not waste any more time. That moment was just pure gold. But I never would have gone there willingly. Life, however, had other plans. Now, in fully accepting and embracing the whole experience and freely sharing the story, the lion attack went from being the worst moment of my life to somehow become the most valuable. And as you go through your life, you will at some stage face your own metaphorical lions. And in the hardest of times, it's going to feel like your world is falling apart. But it's important to remember at these moments that this is just the beginning of a bigger story. This is chapter 1. And in walking the journey through these stories where there are no straight lines, you are going to need help. So don't be shy to seek it out. And the experiences that you face, at very least, they're going to give you depth and perspective and empathy. And these moments are yours. No one can take them away from you, and no one can deny how you felt when these things were taking place. And if you want, these experiences can become a platform for you to share and help others who might be walking through a similar journey. And when you're able to help others as a result of your own pain, then you begin to recognize that these hard moments have not been in vain, and that they are actually helping you to become the human that you really want to be. The harder the experiences you face in your life, the more you will ultimately have to offer the world on the flip side, but not if you keep them in a box. So life is a roller coaster ride, and it's scary and it's thrilling, and there will be moments when you want to get off. But these are the moments often that are just before things get really amazing. And if you try and design a life without those scary bits, then you also end up taking out the joy. And life becomes like being stuck on a really suffocating vanilla merry-go-round where there's just no freedom and no fun. So leap into life. Give as much as you can. And when things get tough, you got to just keep going. Because life will not throw anything at you that you can't handle. Thank you.
In his talk, LHS teacher Seth Donnelly will share lessons he has learned from actively working in solidarity with the liberation movement in Haiti over the past 15 years and with liberation movements inside of the U.S. over the past 30 years. He will discuss connections between these movements and highlight what young activists today can learn from them. Finally, he will make the case for how system change in the U.S. is not only possible today, but an urgent necessity.
Hello. We're here today to talk about the struggle to decolonize from Haiti to the USA and to look at it in a global perspective. We often have an assumption, we being those of us growing up in the United States, as well as many other parts of the world, that the days of colonialism are gone, that we live in a post-colonial world. We do talk about white supremacy, obviously, but what is important to understand is that the struggle to dismantle white supremacy is part and parcel of the struggle to decolonize. White supremacy itself is an outgrowth of European colonialism and slavery. That's what gave birth to white supremacy, and until we get to the root to decolonize, white supremacy will continue to be a problem facing our society. When we talk about colonialism, it's important to just break down some terms. We're talking about when one nation, like Portugal or England, dominates and occupies another nation, like Kenya, Algeria, India. This involves military violence by the invading force. The occupying force involves installing a dictatorship by the colonial power onto the colonized peoples. It involves theft of resources, taking over land, dispossessing peasants, farmers, indigenous peoples from their land, shifting to plantation export to the colonial empire. It involves the exploitation of people's labor. Probably one of the most graphic examples in world history is what Belgium under King Leopold did to the people of the Congo in the late 1800s, where it's been estimated that perhaps as many as 10 million Congolese were murdered in the process of that colonial occupation. It also involves the imposition of culture. So the colonizer imposes their culture. The colonizer claims to be civilized. The colonizer imposes their language. They rename the people. The colonizer establishes new borders. And the colonizer establishes an identity for the dominated people. We can see in this image here that after the conference in Berlin in 1884, European powers literally carved up the continent of Africa, establishing those territories. We have today an illusion that that's all in the past. And so the purpose of my talk is to show that, unfortunately, we have a huge amount of work cut out to decolonize the world. That even though when we look at the world, and my focal point, by the way, will be mostly looking at Haiti as a case study and also looking at the United States. But when we look at the world, like this is the current president of Haiti, Jovenel Moïse. Seems to be an independent leader. That Haiti seems to have its own flag. This is the flags from the United Nations. That we look at the world and we think that there's mostly independent countries. But beneath the surface, a different reality exists. These are miners in the Congo for cobalt and some of the minerals that go into the devices, that, like phones, computers, laptops, etc., that are widely relied upon here in the U.S. and other quote-unquote first world countries. Without their labor, which is basically forms of slavery, this would not exist. The relationship is colonial, but it's more subtle. When we look at the distribution of the world's wealth today, we see that if you look at the top of the pyramid, we see that less than 1% of the world's population, 0.7%, has almost half the world's wealth. The bottom 71% of the world's population, 7 out of every 10 people on the planet, lives off of only 3% of the world's wealth. How can we say we're in a post-colonial world when this distribution of wealth exists today? You could also graph it or map it like a champagne hourglass, like where you look at the top 20% of the world's population consuming that amount of the world's wealth and then going down the line. In fact, the world is becoming more unequal, not less. In the last 40 years, this trend has gotten worse. So we have to look at what are some of the underlying factors here in play. There was a hope in the 1950s, the 1960s, actually kind of developing the aftermath of World War II, after the defeat of Hitler and the Nazis. There was a hope that the world would move beyond colonialism and move beyond white supremacy. Obviously, the Nazis represented a form of white supremacy, and that was the ambition of the Nazis, was to have a new Third Reich empire that would colonize the world. So in the aftermath of World War II, the majority of the people in Latin America, on the planet, in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, were rising up for independence, rising up against what they experienced every day as a form of fascism. In Africa, the wave of independence movements happened in the 50s and 60s. India became independent under Mahatma Gandhi in 1947. There were ongoing struggles as late as the 1970s for independence. This is a painting of one of Africa's most famous independence leaders, Patrice Lumumba from the Congo. He was the first leader of the independent Congo. And so we ask ourselves, what happened? Because this seemed to be the era of change. And when we look at what happened, this is where we can really study, for example, Haiti as a case study. Today, Haiti's experiencing a revolution. It's not covered that extensively in U.S. Mainstream media, but every day there is intense protest, there's intense struggle. The people are mostly struggling nonviolently for their human rights, for true democracy, and they're facing intense repression. How did it get to be this way? Because when we look at what happened to Haiti, we'll also have an understanding, because Haiti is representative of what happened to many of the independence movements of the 50s and 60s. Haiti, before it was taken over by the French, because it was the land of the Arawak and the Taínos, and by all accounts had a very advanced civilization. There's some in Columbus's diary when he first arrived there, and Bartolomé de las Casas, the priest with Columbus, about the civilization they encountered. And it was remarkable for its equality between men and women, for the absence of private property and money, but for a high level of coordination and, in a sense, democratic participation by the people. As we know, Columbus and his men proceeded to wipe out the Arawak and the Taíno in a very short order of time through extreme violence. Bartolomé de las Casas, the priest I mentioned, was literally removed from Haiti because he was speaking out against the genocide, and so he was sent back to Spain. After Spain faded away, France moved in and took over Haiti, and Haiti became France's most lucrative colony. The French, of course, brought in enslaved Africans to do the labor and repopulated the island with enslaved Africans. It became known as Saint-Domingue. It was through over a century of incredible brutality that resistance kept building, and it culminated in the Haitian Revolution that finally triumphed in 1804, defeating Napoleon's army. Napoleon was desperate to keep Haiti as a colony, and the Haitians fought him to a standstill. This was a revolution, the first revolution in world history, that was led by people in slavery. Unlike the American Revolution, which was led by largely slave owners, the Haitian Revolution was led by the people in slavery, who uprooted the system root and branch. So what happened? Today, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It is absolutely impoverished, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's an intense struggle to this day for the most basic human rights. In the case of Haiti, the United States invaded, and right away, France told the independent Haitian Republic in the 1800s that in order for their independence to be recognized and respected internationally by the world powers, Haiti had to pay for its independence. It had to pay the French for what they, quote-unquote, lost in terms of their plantations and the revenue they lost from having Haitians in slavery. So they had to pay for their independence. The U.S. backed up the French under President Thomas Jefferson, and in fact, the U.S. Helped extort that money. That went in all the way through the 1800s, and then in 1915, President Woodrow Wilson sent in Marines to occupy Haiti for 18 years. This occupation, it was during this occupation that the U.S. directly took over debt collection. In fact, Haiti was paying for its independence all the way until the 1940s. And the U.S. took over the debt collection. Under this invasion, the U.S. rewrote the Haitian Constitution and allowed for resources in Haiti to be bought and owned by foreign companies and foreign interests. Many Haitians resisted. The U.S. created a brutal Haitian army as a tool to control Haiti. And eventually the U.S. backed away, removed the troops from Haiti, but shortly after the removal of U.S. troops, the U.S. backed the Duvalier dictatorship, a father and son dictatorship that went on for many, many more years and that safeguarded U.S. business interests as well as continued to terrorize the population through the U.S. trained army. So even though Haiti was technically independent, it wasn't under the Duvaliers. It was actually controlled, in essence, by the United States. This is Charlemagne Peralty, a very famous Haitian peasant leader who resisted the U.S. invasion in 1915. And he was killed by the U.S. Marines, who then strung his body up as a warning to other Haitians not to resist. Remarkably, in the 1980s and 1990s, a mass movement by the Haitian poor broke through and toppled the Duvalier dictatorship. And I say that this is remarkable because this was a nonviolent movement. It was a movement that was against this incredibly well-armed Haitian army, again, backed by the United States. And the people rose up and they got a young priest elected, President Aristide, in 1991, who became the first democratically elected president of Haiti, who then started to carry out measures to benefit the poor, doubling the minimum wage, dissolving the army, turning land over to the poor, doing things that were immensely popular with the population. This is well documented, and by the way, the movement behind President Aristide is called TEDxLAHS, which in Creole means flood. The idea is that each of us is a drop of water, and together we become a flood for change. And so the TEDxLAHS movement, with President Aristide representing it, was able to achieve a lot in terms of health care, human rights, women's rights, education. And this is well documented in this brochure, We Will Not Forget, the Achievements of TEDxLAHS. To make a long story short, Aristide was not permitted, and the TEDxLAHS movement was not permitted to continue to rebuild Haiti. He was removed by U.S.-backed coups. That's a violent overthrow of an elected leader, backed by the CIA and the U.S. government twice, once in 1991 and again after Aristide returned in 2004. My work in Haiti begins after the second coup. So I've been to Haiti more than 20 times, documenting human rights, doing educational work in the country since then. But ever since that second coup in 2004, Haitians have been subjected to a series of puppet governments, the most recent one being Jovenel Moïse, who I started my presentation with. This is Moïse in the White House a few years ago with Vice President Pence. Moise exists because the U.S. installed him. He exists as president. The elections in Haiti were financed by the U.S. They were racked with clearly, empirically demonstrable fraud. And in Haiti, Haitians call them selections. His function is to safeguard the oligarchy, a small upper class in Haiti, to look after the interests of American businesses and other foreign corporations, and to continue to maintain the apartheid or exclusionary structure of power in Haiti. So again, even though Haiti is technically independent, it remains under the boot of the United States. Haitians then are fighting for real democracy. They're fighting for decolonization in the year 2021. And that is the case with many other quote-unquote third world countries like the Congo. Patrice Lumumba, who I showed the painting of earlier, he was murdered in a CIA coup in the 60s, backed by the CIA and the Belgian government. The Congo never had an opportunity to become independent for long. And instead, the U.S. installed the Mobutu dictatorship. A similar pattern persists in country after country after country, and I know our time is limited. But the point is, the world never really fully decolonized because the American empire, which emerged after World War II, as Dr. King said, stood on the wrong side of the world revolution. One of the last speeches Martin Luther King gave was against the Vietnam War in Riverside Church in Harlem. And in this speech, he said, the United States government is on the wrong side of the world revolution. And what he meant by that is the movement by the poor to decolonize. In the name of fighting communism, the United States was actually waging war on the poor majority of the planet, knocking out non-communist leaders like Aristide, Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Lumumba in the Congo, but using communism as the excuse. Today, it's other forms of subterfuge, like the war on terrorism, or etc. But where we're at then is that we need to educate ourselves as to the real function of our society, the U.S. society, vis-a-vis, in terms of maintaining that global inequality that we talked about. We also need to look at every day in Haiti, there's young people, the peers of our students, like Stanley Noel, who are being gunned down just for the most simple demands. And as we struggle to be in solidarity with the people of Haiti, we have to understand that there's struggles to decolonize within the United States. Some of us are already involved in those struggles. Some of us need to get involved. Some of us need to be in solidarity, such as the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, led by indigenous nations and activists to protect sacred indigenous land in the U.S. and to stop various forms of dirty energy from expanding. We see, of course, with the Black Lives Matter movement, that the struggle against white supremacy is part and parcel, again, of the struggle of understanding that black people themselves within the United States have been subjected to the most vicious form of colonialism throughout the start of U.S. history, and that it's a struggle for black self-determination and decolonization. The United States itself was founded on settler colonialism. This is a situation where the colonizers come and live directly in the lands that they take over while exterminating the indigenous peoples who are already here. The founding fathers, like George Washington, was responsible for campaigns of genocide. We know that George Washington ordered destruction of many indigenous communities and villages. We know, of course, that before the United States was formed, there was about 12 to 50 million indigenous peoples here. And by the late 1800s, according to the U.S. government's own census, the indigenous population had been reduced to 250,000. This was a systematic genocide on par with the worst genocides in world history. That we know that the United States then brought in millions and millions of enslaved Africans to do the hard labor that was the backdrop, the fundamental foundation for the U.S. economy, not just in the South, but in the North. And that we know that the United States, these are indigenous reservations. What has been left, all of this land belonged to different indigenous nations before the U.S., and then indigenous peoples were herded onto these reservations. This land here was all Mexico. Who crossed the border? The South which was the base of slavery, could arguably, there's been a struggle for many generations to understand that that's actually colonized territory, that black people have been colonized, after the Civil War, did black people ever receive land? Did they ever break up were the plantations broken up? When did this country actually really deal with white supremacy and colonialism? It didn't. So therefore, it's up to us. And we can see the unity established as a way forward between, this is Yuri Kochiyama, an incredible Asian American activist who was very close with Malcolm X, who understood that the struggles of the Asian American Pacific Islander community must be linked and connected to the struggle for black liberation. We see other revolutionary leaders, Asada, who's currently living in Cuba because she had to flee the United States due to repression. Victor Jara, the Chilean folk singer who stood up for the rights of the Chilean people, who was also murdered in a U.S.-backed coup. These names should be household names for us. We must understand that as we move forward, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. To quote the late Audre Lorde, that together through our solidarity, we can decolonize the United States, we can be in solidarity with the people of Haiti, and we can see a world where the wealth is shared equally amongst all the world's peoples. Thank you very much. And for anybody who would like more information on the struggle in Haiti today, please go to HaitiSolidarity.net.
That concludes all of our TEDx speakers this year. We encourage all of you that watch to spark conversation about these talks with your friends and family and implement lessons learned into your lives. With this newfound knowledge, we can help cultivate change in our society.
Before we go, we'd like to give thanks to everyone who made this event possible.
First off, thank you to all the speakers for taking your time to work with us and share your ideas. We really appreciate all the work you put into your TED Talks.
Next, we want to thank everyone in the TEDxLAHS Club who worked so hard to organize this event. As someone in the club, I can totally say that it wasn't easy.
And a big thank you to Mr. Jack, our club advisor, for guiding us through this process.
Lastly, thank you to all of you who are watching this virtual event. Having an audience for these speakers to present to, even if it's virtually, is extremely important.
Thank you for listening.